Hi guys, let's start chapter number 8, that is clothing, a social history. It is easy to forget that there is a history to the clothes we wear. All societies observe certain rules, some of them quite strict, about the way in which men, women, and children should dress, or how different social classes and groups should present themselves. These norms come to define the identity of people, the way they see themselves, the way they want others to see them. They shape our notions of grace and beauty, ideas of modesty and shame. As times change and societies are transformed, these notions also alter. Modifications in clothing come to reflect these changes. The emergence of the modern world is marked by dramatic changes in clothing. In this chapter, we will look at some of the histories of clothing in the modern period, that is, in the 19th and 20th centuries. Why are these two centuries important? Before the age of democratic revolutions and the development of capitalist markets in the 18th century Europe, most people dressed according to their regional codes. So, most people dressed according to their regional codes and were limited by the types of clothes and the cost of material that were available in their region. Clothing styles were also strictly regulated by class, gender, or status in the social hierarchy. So, clothing styles were also strictly regulated by class, by gender, or by status in the social hierarchy. After the 18th century, the colonization of most of the world by Europe, the spread of democratic ideals, and the growth of an industrial society completely changed the ways in which people thought about dress and its meanings. People could use styles and materials that were drawn from other cultures and locations, and Western dress styles for men were adopted worldwide. In chapter 1, you have seen how the French Revolution transformed many aspects of social and political life. The revolution also swept away existing dress codes, known as the sumptuary laws. So the revolution also swept away existing dress codes known as the sumptuary laws. Let us look briefly at what these laws were. Number 1. Sumptuary laws and social hierarchy. In medieval Europe, dress codes were sometimes imposed upon members of different layers of society through actual laws which were spelled out in some detail. From about 1294 to the time of the French Revolution in 1789, the people of France were expected to strictly follow what were known as sumptuary laws. So they were made to follow sumptuary laws. The laws tried to control the behavior of those considered social inferiors, preventing them from wearing certain clothes, consuming certain foods and beverages. Usually, this referred to alcohol and hunting game in certain areas. In medieval France, the items of clothing a person could purchase per year was regulated, not only by income but also by social rank. The material to be used for clothing was also legally prescribed. So, the material to be used for clothing was also legally prescribed. Only royalty could wear expensive materials like ermine and fur, or silk, velvet, and brocade. Other classes were debarred from clothing themselves with materials that were associated with the aristocracy. So only royalty could wear expensive materials like ermine and fur, or silk, velvet, and brocade. The French Revolution ended these distinctions. As you know from Chapter 1, members of the Jacobin clubs even called themselves the sans-culottes to distinguish themselves from the aristocracy who wore the fashionable knee breeches. So, Jacobean clubs even called themselves the sans-culottes to distinguish themselves who from the aristocracy who wore the fashionable knee breeches. Sans-culottes literally meant those without knee breeches. From now on, both men and women began wearing clothing that was loose and comfortable. The colors of France, that is blue, white, and red, became popular as they were a sign of the patriotic citizen. Other political symbols too became a part of dress. The red cape of liberty, the red cape of liberty, long trousers, and a revolutionary cockade pinned on to a hat. The simplicity of clothing was meant to express the idea of equality. Here is the figure 1. So, figure 1, an upper class couple in 18th century England, painting by the English artist Thomas Gainsborough, 1727 to 1788. New word, cockade. It's a cape usually worn on one side. Then ermine. It would be a type of fur. So here is figure 3, women of the middle classes, 1791. Figure 4, volunteers during the French Revolution. So these are the volunteers during the French Revolution. Then figure 2, an aristocratic couple on the eve of the French Revolution. Notice the sumptuous clothing, the elaborate headgear, and the lace edgings on the dress the lady is wearing. She also has a corset inside the dress. This was meant to confine and shape her waist so that she appeared narrow-waisted. The nobleman, as was the custom of the time, is wearing a long soldier's cloth. The nobleman, as was the custom of the time, is wearing a long soldier's coat. So he's wearing a coat, knee breeches, then silk stockings, and high-heeled shoes. Both of them have elaborate wigs, and both have their faces painted a delicate shade of pink, for the display of natural skin was considered uncultured. So, this is the aristocratic couple. Then we have a figure 5. A sans-culotte family, 1793. Box 1. Not all sumptuary laws were meant to emphasize social hierarchy. Some sumptuary laws were passed to protect home production against imports. For instance, in 16th century England, velvet caps made with material imported from France and Italy were popular amongst men. England passed a law which compelled all persons over 6 years of age, except those of high position, to wear woolen capes made in England on Sundays and all holidays. This law remained in effect for 26 years and was very useful in building up the English woolen industry. 2. Clothing and notions of beauty. The end of sumptuary laws did not mean that everyone in European societies could now dress in the same way. The French Revolution had raised the question of equality and ended aristocratic privileges, as well as the laws that maintained those privileges. However, differences between social strata remained. Clearly, the poor could not dress like the rich, nor eat the same food. But laws no longer barred people's right to dress in the way they wished. Differences in earning rather than sumptuary laws now defined what the rich and poor could wear, and different classes developed their own culture of dress. The notion of what was beautiful or ugly, proper or improper, decent or vulgar differed. Here's figure 6. Scene of an upper class wedding by the English painter William Hogarth, 1697 to 1764. We have another painting, figure 7. A child in an aristocratic household by the English painter William Hogarth, 1697 to 1764. Notice the tiny waist even at this age, probably held in by a corset, and the sweeping gown, which would restrict her movement. Styles of clothing also emphasized differences between men and women. Women in Victorian England were groomed from childhood to be docile and dutiful, submissive and obedient. The ideal woman was one who could bear pain and suffering, while men were expected to be serious, strong, independent, and aggressive. Women were seen as frivolous, delicate, passive, and docile. Norms of clothing reflected these ideals. From childhood, girls were tightly laced up and dressed in stays. The effort was to restrict the growth of their bodies, contain them within small molds. When slightly older, girls had to wear tight-fitting corsets. Tightly laced, small-waisted women were admired as attractive, elegant, and graceful. Clothing thus played a part in creating the image of frail, submissive Victorian women. 2.1. How did women react to these norms? Many women believed in the ideals of womanhood. The ideals were in the air they breathed, the literature they read, the education they had received at school and at home. From childhood, they grew up to believe that having a small waist was a womanly duty. Suffering pain was essential to being a woman. To be seen as attractive, to be womanly, they had to wear the corset. The torture and pain this inflicted on the body was to accept it was to be accepted as normal. So the torture and pain this inflicted on the body was to be accepted as normal. But not everyone accepted these values. Over the 19th century, ideas changed. By the 1830s, women in England began agitating for democratic rights. As the suffrage movement developed, many began campaigning for dress reform. Women's magazines described how tight dresses and corsets caused deformities and illness among young girls. Here are some new words. Stays. Support as part of a women's dress to hold the body straight. Corset. A closely fitting and stiff inner bodice worn by women. Corset, a closely fitting and stiff inner bodice worn by women to give shape and support to the figure. Suffrage, the right to vote. The suffragettes wanted the right for women to vote. Such clothing restricted body growth and hampered blood circulation. So, they restricted body growth and hampered blood circulation. Muscles remained underdeveloped and the spines got bent. Doctors reported that many women were regularly complaining of acute weakness, felt languid, and fainted frequently. Corsets then became necessary to hold up the weakened spine. Source A. Mary Somerville, one of the first women mathematicians, describes in her memoirs the experience of her childhood days. Although perfectly straight and well made, I was encased in stiff stays with a steel busk in front, while above my frock bands drew my shoulder back until the shoulder blades met. Then a steel rod with a semicircle which went under my chin was clasped to the steel busk in my stays. In this constrained state, I and most of the younger girls had to prepare our lessons. We have another source, source B. Many government officials of the time were alarmed at the health complications of the prevailing styles of dressing amongst women. Consider the following attack on the corset. It is evident sociologically that air is the pabulum of life, and that the effect of a tight coat round the neck and of tight lacing differ only in degrees, for the strangulations are both fatal. To wear tight stays in many cases is to wither, to waste, to die. We have another source, source C. Do you know how the famous English poet John Keats, 1795 to 1821, described his ideal woman? He said, "She was like a milk-white lamb that bleeds for man's protection." In his novel Vanity Fair, 1848, Thackeray described the charm of a woman character, Amelia, in these words: "I think it was her weakness which was her principal charm, a kind of sweet submission and softness which seemed to appeal to each man she met, for his sympathy and protection." Here are some new words. Busk, a strip of wood, whalebone or steel, in front of the corset to stiffen and support it. Pabulum, anything essential to maintain life and growth. In America, a similar movement developed amongst the white settlers on the East Coast. Traditional feminine clothes were criticized on a variety of grounds. Long skirts. Okay, so long skirts, it was said, swept the floors and collected filth and dirt. This caused illness. The skirts were voluminous and difficult to handle. They hampered movement and prevented women from working and earning. Reform of the dress, it was said, would change the position of women. If clothes were comfortable and convenient, then women could work, earn their living, and become independent. In the 1870s, the National Women Suffrage Association, headed by Mrs. Stanton, and the American Women Suffrage Association, dominated by Lucy Stone, both campaigned for dress reform. The argument was simplify dress, shorten skirts, and abandon corsets. On both sides of the Atlantic, there was now a movement for rational dress reform. So they want rational dress reform. So here's a figure 8. A women in 19th century USA before the dress reforms. Notice the flowing gown sweeping the ground. Reformers reacted to this type of clothing for women. Box 2. The movement for rational dress reform. Mrs. Amelia Bloomer, an American, was the first dress reformer to launch loose tunics worn over ankle-length trousers. The trousers were known as bloomers, rationals, or knickerbockers. The Rational Dress Society was started in England in 1881 but did not achieve significant results. It was the First World War that brought about radical changes in women's clothing. The reformers did not immediately succeed in changing social values. They had to face ridicule and hostility. Conservatives everywhere opposed change. They lamented that women who gave up traditional norms of dressing. Okay, so some people were opposed it, mostly the conservatives. They lamented that women who gave up traditional norms of dressing no longer looked beautiful and lost their femininity and grace. Faced with persistent attacks, many women reformers changed back into traditional clothes to conform to conventions. By the end of the 19th century, however, change was clearly in the air. Ideals of beauty and styles of clothing were both transformed under a variety of pressures. People began accepting the ideas of reformers they had earlier ridiculed. With new times came new values. New times. What were these new times? What created the pressure for change? Many changes were made possible in Britain due to the introduction of new materials and technologies. Other changes came about because of the two world wars and the new working conditions for women. Let us retrace our steps a few centuries to see what these changes were. 3.1 New materials. Before the 19th century, most ordinary women in Britain possessed very few clothes made of flax, linen, or wool. or wool, which were difficult to clean. After 1600, trade with India brought cheap, beautiful, and easy to maintain Indian ginges within the reach of many Europeans who could now increase the size of their wardrobes. So after 1600, trade with India brought cheap, beautiful, and easy to maintain Indian ginges within the reach of many Europeans who could now increase the size of their wardrobes. Then, during the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, Britain began the mass manufacture of cotton textiles, which it exported to many parts of the world, including India. Cotton clothes became more accessible to a wider section of people in Europe. By the early 20th century, artificial fibers made clothes cheaper still and easier to wash and maintain. So, by the early 20th century, artificial fibers made clothes cheaper still and easier to wash and maintain. In the late 1870s, heavy restrictive underclothes which had created such a storm in the pages of women's magazines were gradually discarded. Clothes got lighter, shorter, and simpler. So here are some examples. Figure 9, changes in clothing in the early 20th century. Figure 9a, even for middle and upper class women, clothing styles changed. Skirts became shorter and frills were done away with. Then we have figure 9b. Women working at a British ammunition factory during the First World War. At this time, thousands of women came out to work as war production created a demand for increased labor. The need for easy movement changed clothing styles. We have a new word, ginge. Cotton cloths printed with designs and flowers from the Hindi word chint. Yet until 1914, clothes were ankle length, as they had been since the 13th century. By 1915, however, the hemline of the skirt rose dramatically to mid-calf. So by 1915, the hemline of the skirt rose dramatically to mid-calf. Why this sudden change? 3.2 The War. Changes in women's clothing came about as a result of the two world wars. So it was the result of two world wars. Many European women stopped wearing jewelry and luxurious clothes. As upper class women mixed with other classes, social barriers were eroded and women began to dress in a similar ways. So they began to dress in similar ways. Clothes got shorter. So clothes got shorter during the First World War, that is from 1914 to 1918, out of practical necessity. By 1917, over 700,000 women in Britain were employed in ammunition factories. They wore a working uniform of blouse and trousers with accessories such as scarves, which was later replaced by khaki overalls and capes. Bright colors faded from sight and only sober colors were worn as the war dragged on. Thus clothes became plainer and simpler. Skirts became shorter. Soon, trousers became a vital part of Western women's clothing, giving them greater freedom of movement. Most important, women took to cutting their hair short for convenience. So, the dress became shorter, and women even cut their hair shorter for convenience. By the 20th century, a plain and austerer by the 20th century, a plain and austere style came to reflect seriousness and professionalism. So they represent seriousness and professionalism. New schools for children emphasized the importance of plain dresses and discouraged ornamentation. Gymnastics and games entered the school curriculum for women. As women took to sports, they had to wear clothes that did not hamper movement. When they went out to work, they needed clothes that were comfortable and convenient. So we see that the history of clothing is linked to the larger history of society. We saw how clothing was defined by dominant cultural attitudes and ideals of beauty, and how these notions changed over time. We saw how reformers and conservatives struggled to change these ideals, and how changes within technology and economy and the pressures of new times made people feel the need for change. Number 4. Transformations in colonial India. Here's the figure 10. Parsis in Bombay, 1863. And in figure 11, converts to Christianity in Goa in 1907 who have adopted Western dress. So they are wearing Western dress. So, transformations in colonial India. What about India in this same period? During the colonial period, there were significant changes in male and female clothing in India. On the one hand, this was a consequence of the influence of Western dress reforms and missionary activity. On the other, it was due to the effort by Indians to fashion clothing styles that embodied an indigenous tradition and culture. So, on the one hand, this was a consequence of the influence of the Western dress forms and missionary activities. On the other, it was due to the effort by Indians to fashion clothing styles that embodied an indigenous tradition and culture. Clothes and clothing, in fact, became very important symbols of the national movement. A brief look at the 19th century changes will tell us a great deal about the transformations of the 20th century. When Western style clothing came into India in the 19th century, Indians reacted in three different ways. So, Indians reacted in three different ways. The first one is this is number 1. Many, especially men, began incorporating some elements of Western style clothing in their dress. The wealthy Parsis of Western India were among the first to adapt Western style clothing. Baggy trousers and fanta or hat were added to long, collarless coats with boots and a walking stick to complete the look of the gentleman. To some, Western clothes were a sign of modernity and progress. Western style clothing was also specially attractive to groups of Dalit converts to Christianity who now found it liberating. Here too it was men rather than women who affected the new dress styles. We have number 2. There were others who were convinced that Western culture would lead to a loss of traditional cultural identity. The use of Western styled clothes was taken as a sign of the world turning upside down. The cartoon of the Bengali Babu shown here mocks him for wearing Western style boots and hat and coat along with his dhoti. So, here is the third type, how the people reacted. Some men resolved this dilemma by wearing Western clothes without giving up their Indian ones. Many Bengali bureaucrats in the late 19th century began stocking Western style clothes for work. So, for work, they wear Western style clothes for work outside the home and changed into more comfortable Indian clothes at home. Early 20th century anthropologist Warrior Ulwin remembered that policemen in Pune who were going off duty would take their trousers off in the street and walk home in just tunic and undergarments. This difference between outer and inner worlds is still observed by some men today. So the first type of people are that they wore the Western style clothing. And the second one is that they're conservative. They think that if they wear the Western style clothing, then it means that it shows or it will lead to a loss of traditional cultural identity. And the third type of reaction is that they wore both. For Western style clothes, they wear them while going for work, and at home they changed it to their comfortable Indian clothes. So they wore both. Here is figure 13, cartoon from Indian Charivari, 1873. So it's a cartoon. Then we have another figure, figure 12, cartoon The Modern Patriot by Gaganendranath Tagore, early 20th century. A sarcastic picture of a foolish man who copies Western dress but claims to love his motherland with all his heart. The pot-bellied man with cigarette and Western clothes was ridiculed in many cartoons of the time. Still others tried a slightly different solution to the same dilemma. They attempted to combine, the fourth type would be they attempted to combine Western and Indian forms of dressing. These changes in clothing, however, had a turbulent history. So let's continue in the next part of our video. So that's all, guys. See you in my next video. Bye.